In the heart of Hertfordshire, just north of London, sits Childwickbury Manor, the sprawling estate Stanley Kubrick called home for decades. The manor's serene façade, with its ivy-covered stone walls and meticulously kept grounds, belied the chilling whispers that surrounded its history. While Kubrick's genius crafted films of psychological terror, few knew the real horror unfolded within the walls of his own home. For years, locals spoke in hushed tones of the Kubrick curse, a shadowy force that seemed to plague anyone who lingered too long in the manor. The stories were always similar objects moving on their own, disembodied voices echoing through the halls, and the feeling of being watched. But it wasn't until Rebecca Carter, a young American filmmaker, arrived to document the late director's life that the terror truly took form. Rebecca's dream was simple: to create a documentary about Kubrick's artistic process, uncovering the secrets of his brilliance. Securing access to the manor was a coup, thanks to Kubrick's daughter, Vivian, who had grown reclusive over the years. Rebecca's team, consisting of her cameraman Kyle Jenkins and sound engineer Lauren Hayes, set up in the manor's grand library a room filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves, shadowy alcoves, and the faint smell of old paper. From the moment they stepped inside, the air felt heavy. "It's just the history," Rebecca assured herself, brushing off her unease. But Kyle noticed something odd. No matter where he stood, the library's chandelier seemed to sway gently, though the air was perfectly still. Lauren, who had a knack for catching faint sounds, began hearing whispers through her headphones, even when the equipment wasn't recording. That night, Rebecca stayed in what had once been Kubrick's study, determined to absorb the energy of the space. She awoke to a rhythmic tapping. Groggy, she scanned the room, her eyes catching a flicker of movement by the massive oak desk. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, Rebecca heard it, a deep, raspy voice murmuring, "Why are you here?" The next morning, the team found Rebecca pale and shaken. She recounted the incident, but they dismissed it as a vivid dream brought on by exhaustion. But then, as they reviewed the footage from the day before, they froze. In one frame, as Kyle panned the camera across the library, a reflection appeared in the glass of a cabinet, a tall, shadowy figure standing behind Rebecca, though no one had been there at the time. By the third day, the manor's malevolence escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own. Lauren's sound equipment picked up guttural growls, and Kyle swore he saw a face staring back at him from the library's mirror. They decided to cut the project short, but when they tried to leave, their rental van wouldn't start. The locals, aware of the manor's reputation, refused to come near after dark. Desperate, they spent one final night in the house. Rebecca, unable to sleep, decided to confront whatever was haunting them. She wandered into the manor's basement, a labyrinth of stone corridors and forgotten rooms. In the dim light of her flashlight, she found a door she hadn't noticed before. It was small and warped, as though the wood had been swollen by decades of damp. As she pushed it open, a wave of freezing air hit her, and the beam of her flashlight illuminated a room lined with crude drawings scratched into the walls, faces twisted in agony, strange symbols, and a single word etched repeatedly: Kubrick. In the center of the room lay an old film reel, unlabeled and coated in dust. Trembling, Rebecca picked it up, her breath visible in the icy air. That's when she heard it again, the same voice from her nightmare. Clearer now: "You shouldn't have come." The door slammed shut behind her. Rebecca screamed, pounding on the wood, as the air grew thinner and colder. Upstairs, Kyle and Lauren awoke to the sound of her cries, but found no trace of her. When the door finally gave way, the room was empty, the film reel gone. To this day, Rebecca Carter has never been found. Her disappearance remains a mystery, but Kyle and Lauren both abandoned filmmaking after their experience, refusing to speak publicly about what happened. Those who dare to visit Childwickbury Manor claim the house itself feels alive, as though it's waiting for its next guest to uncover its secrets and pay the price. The estate remains privately owned, and no one has dared to document its history since. The locals still talk about the young American filmmaker who disappeared, warning any curious visitor. Kubrick captured the essence of terror in his films, but he learned it from the house itself, In the weeks following Rebecca's disappearance, Kyle and Lauren returned to the United States, but neither could escape the grip of what they had witnessed. Kyle found himself plagued by insomnia, convinced he was being followed. Shadows darted in the corners of his vision, and objects in his apartment were never where he left them. Lauren, on the other hand, became obsessed with the recordings they had salvaged before fleeing Childwickbury Manor. One night, unable to sleep, Lauren replayed the footage of the shadowy figure in the library. She adjusted the sound levels, amplifying the faint whispers she had captured that day. Her hands trembled as the words became clearer. The room. Let her in, let who in? Lauren wondered, her heart pounding. Was it referring to Rebecca or something else entirely? The next day, she called Kyle, urging him to meet her at her studio. Reluctantly, he agreed, though his voice cracked with hesitation. "I don't want to go back to any of this," he warned her. But by nightfall he arrived, his face gaunt and pale. Lauren had uncovered something she couldn't explain. In one of the final clips, as the camera scanned the basement corridors, there was a brief flash, just a single frame of Rebecca staring directly into the lens. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her mouth stretched into a silent scream. But it wasn't just Rebecca's face that froze them. Behind her, barely visible in the darkness, was the outline of a figure tall, angular, and distinctly inhuman. "That's impossible," Kyle whispered. "I was holding the camera. Rebecca wasn't even there when I filmed this." The room fell silent as they stared at the still image on Lauren's monitor. Then, almost imperceptibly, the lights in the studio flickered. "Do you feel that?" Lauren whispered. The air had grown cold, just as it had in the basement of the manor. The faint hum of her equipment began to waver, shifting into a low, guttural growl. The screen crackled, static filling the speakers, and then a voice cut through. "It's not over." The power surged, plunging the studio into darkness. Kyle fumbled for his phone's flashlight, but when the beam illuminated the room, the monitor was on again, though neither of them had touched it. The screen now displayed an image neither of them had recorded. The same basement door Rebecca had opened, but this time it was wide open. The room beyond was no longer lined with walls, but appeared to stretch endlessly into blackness. "I don't think it's just the house," Lauren said, her voice trembling. "Whatever this is, it's following us." Kyle stood frozen, staring at the screen. When the voice came again, louder and more forceful this time, "The real must return." "What real?" Kyle snapped, his voice breaking with panic. Lauren suddenly remembered the manila envelope she had grabbed in a rush as they fled the manor. She tore through her bag, pulling it out. Inside was a single item, a photograph of Stanley Kubrick in his study, seated at his desk. But something was wrong. Though the photo had clearly been taken decades earlier, the scratch symbols from the basement walls were visible on the desk behind him, as if they had always been there, waiting to be noticed. Kyle grabbed the photo, flipping it over. Scrawled on the back, in jagged, almost desperate handwriting, were the words, "It doesn't belong here." "What doesn't belong?" Lauren whispered, her eyes darting around the darkened room as if expecting an answer. As if in response, the photo in Kyle's hands began to smolder, the edges curling with heat. He dropped it with a yelp, but before it hit the floor, it disintegrated into ash. Lauren backed away, clutching her bag. "We need to stop. We need to let this go." But Kyle shook his head. "If we stop now, it'll never let us go." Neither of them noticed the small red light flickering on Lauren's recording device, as though it had just begun capturing something. Something they hadn't invited into the room. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The recording device in Lauren's bag let out a faint beep, breaking the suffocating silence. She froze, her blood running cold. She hadn't turned it on, and the batteries were nearly dead, she was sure of that. Slowly, she reached for the bag, her hands trembling. "Lauren, don't," Kyle hissed, stepping back. But her curiosity had already taken hold. She pulled the device free and pressed play. At first, there was only static, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Then, faintly, came a sound that made them both stop breathing, a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, like a pulse reverberating through a vast, empty space. As they listened, the heartbeat grew louder, faster, until it morphed into a frantic pounding, as though someone or something was trying to break through. Then came the voice again, low and distorted, but unmistakable. "You opened it." Kyle's phone buzzed violently in his pocket, startling them both. He fumbled to answer, his voice cracking as he muttered, "Hello?" There was no response, just the faint sound of breathing. But as the seconds ticked by, the breathing became heavier, harsher, until it was joined by a chilling, rasping laugh. Then, just as abruptly, the line went dead. Kyle dropped the phone, his hands shaking. "Lauren, we need to go. Now!" But Lauren wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the device in her hand. The audio had stopped, replaced by a single, flickering line of text on the tiny screen, returned to where it began. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Before Kyle could answer, the studio lights flickered back on. But something was wrong. The room wasn't as they had left it. The walls, once bare, were now covered in smeared symbols, the same ones they had seen in the basement of Childwickbury Manor. The air was thick with the scent of burning film, acrid and sharp, and the faint crackle of static filled their ears. Kyle backed toward the door, his voice rising in panic. "We're not safe here. We need to leave." But as he reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, yanking with all his strength, but the door remained sealed, as if the house itself had decided to trap them. Lauren's eyes darted around the room, her breath shallow. "It's not just the manor," she said, her voice trembling. "It's spreading. It's everywhere now." And then, as if on cue, the recording device began to play again, though Lauren hadn't touched it. The heartbeat returned, slower this time, deliberate and methodical. But this time it wasn't alone. Beneath the pulse came another sound of faint, metallic whirring, like the winding of an old film reel. Kyle turned, his eyes wide with horror. "Do you hear that?" Lauren nodded, clutching the device to her chest. The sound grew louder, drowning out everything else, until it felt as though the room itself was vibrating. And then, just as suddenly, the lights went out again, plunging them into complete darkness. In the silence that followed, they both heard it. Footsteps, slow and purposeful, approaching from somewhere deep within the building. Kyle fumbled for his flashlight, but the beam flickered weakly, barely cutting through the oppressive dark. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice breaking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the shadows, the voice came again, closer this time, almost mocking. "You should have stayed away." The flashlight flickered once more, and for a split second, it illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the room. Its face was shrouded in darkness, but its eyes cold, unblinking, and inhuman gleamed like twin pinpricks of light. And then the flashlight went out. Kyle and Lauren were left in the suffocating darkness, the faint sound of the film reel spinning somewhere in the distance. But this time, it wasn't just the sound that surrounded them, it was the sense of something ancient, something relentless, closing in. "Lauren," Kyle whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't think we can outrun this." From the darkness, the voice replied, clear and cold, "You can't." And then the door creaked open. The creak of the door seemed impossibly loud, cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. Kyle and Lauren turned in unison toward the sound, but the blackness beyond the threshold was impenetrable. A cold draft swept into the room, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth and something metallic, blood, perhaps. Kyle gripped Lauren's arm, his knuckles white. "We don't go out there," he whispered. "Whatever it is, it wants us to." But Lauren wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on the recording device in her hand. The screen had come alive again, the faint glow casting eerie shadows on her face. This time, the words were different. "There is no out." The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound distant and distorted, like the static of an old television set. It grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of whispers, each voice layered upon the next, overlapping in a maddening chorus. Lauren's grip tightened around the recorder. "Do "Do you hear them?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the noise. Kyle nodded, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "They're calling names," and they were. The whispers were distinct now, each voice intoning a name. Rebecca, Vivian, Stanley, and then, chillingly, their own. Lauren, Kyle. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until the sound was almost unbearable. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. A single voice spoke next, clear and resonant, echoing from the depths of the hallway beyond the open door. "Come and see." Lauren took a hesitant step forward, as if compelled by some unseen force. "No," Kyle hissed, grabbing her arm. "This is how it gets you. Don't listen." But Lauren's eyes were vacant, her body stiff. "We don't have a choice," she murmured. "It's already inside." Kyle turned to face her fully, shaking her shoulders. "Lauren, snap out of it. We can fight this." The words died in his throat as the dim glow from the recording device illuminated her face. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her pupils had turned completely black. "Lauren?" Kyle's voice cracked as he stumbled backward. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was too wide, her teeth too sharp, her head tilting unnaturally to one side. When she spoke, her voice wasn't her own. It was layered, distorted, as though a dozen voices were speaking through her. "He showed us the way. Now you will follow." Kyle bolted for the door, the panic in his chest threatening to consume him. But as he crossed the threshold, he realized with dawning horror that the hallway beyond wasn't the familiar corridor of Lauren's studio. It was the basement of Childwickbury Manor. The walls were damp and cold, the symbols from the photographs etched deep into the stone. The air was heavy, filled with the same rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Lauren!" Kyle shouted, spinning around, but she wasn't there. Instead, the doorway behind him was gone, replaced by a solid stone wall. He stumbled forward, his breath coming in panicked gasps, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. The corridor stretched endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. And then, up ahead, he saw it, the door. The warped, swollen wood was unmistakable, its surface covered in claw-like scratches. Kyle hesitated, his heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but there was no back. There was only the door. As he approached, the heartbeat grew louder, reverberating through his skull. His hand reached out, almost against his will, and as his fingers touched the cold wood, the whispers returned, louder and more frenzied than ever. "It's not just the house," they chanted. It's him. He brought it here. The door creaked open. On the other side was not a room, but a vast expanse of darkness, the kind that seemed to stretch forever. At its center stood an old film projector, its reel spinning silently. The light from the projector flickered, casting shadows that moved unnaturally, as if alive. Kyle stepped closer, drawn by an inexplicable force. The film began to play, the flickering images casting the room in a sickly glow. At first, the footage was chaotic, a blur of faces, symbols, and shadowy figures. But then it focused. The screen showed Rebecca, sitting in the room where they had last seen her. She was staring directly at the camera, her expression blank, her eyes hollow. "Help me," she whispered, and then the screen went dark. Kyle's breath hitched as the projector began to spin faster, the whirring noise growing louder until it became deafening. The reel snapped, the film flapping wildly, and the whispers returned, now a scream. "It's too late." The darkness surged forward, engulfing him. And then, the darkness enveloped Kyle completely, swallowing him in an icy void. He couldn't see, couldn't move, and yet he felt the weight of something immense pressing down on him, an ancient, malevolent presence that had been waiting for him all along. A flicker of light appeared in the distance, faint at first, but growing steadily brighter. It wasn't comforting. It was cold, sterile, and pulsating like the beam of a projector. Kyle stumbled toward it, desperate for any sense of direction. The light revealed a room. He was back in the study from the photo Stanley Kubrick Sanctuary, but something was off. The furniture was rotting, the walls decayed, and the air carried the acrid smell of burning celluloid. At the desk sat a figure, slouched over, unmoving. Its back was to Kyle, but he could see the tattered remains of a director's chair beneath it. A reel of film was spinning on the desk, casting a faint glow that illuminated symbols carved deep into the wood. Who are you?" Kyle's voice wavered, barely audible over the hum of the reel. The figure shifted slightly, its movements unnatural, like a marionette being jerked into position. Slowly, it turned to face him, and Kyle's stomach dropped. It was Kubrick, or what was left of him. His face was pale and stretched, his eyes sunken black voids, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. His hands, skeletal and gnarled, gripped the edges of the desk as he leaned forward. "The masterpiece," Kubrick rasped, his voice a haunting echo that seemed to reverberate through Kyle's skull. "It demanded more than I could give. But now it has you." The reel spun faster, the light growing harsher, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Images began to flicker on the wall, scenes from Kyle's life. His childhood home, his friends, his worst fears. And then, the image of Lauren appeared, her face contorted in agony as she stood in the endless hallway. She was screaming, her voice silent against the deafening hum. "Let her go!" Kyle shouted, his fear morphing into desperation. "Take me instead." Kubrick's smile widened, his head tilting unnaturally to one side. "It already has you both." The reel snapped, and the room was plunged into chaos. The walls cracked, the symbols glowing red-hot, and the whispers turned into guttural screams. Kyle felt the ground give way beneath him, and he fell into the darkness, his body weightless, his mind filled with the haunting echo of Kubrick's laughter. When he woke, Kyle was back in Lauren's studio. The lights were on, the air still, as if nothing had happened. But Lauren was gone. The recording device lay on the floor, its screen cracked but still faintly glowing. He picked it up with trembling hands, pressing play one last time. The audio was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Lauren's voice, distant and broken, "Don't come back. Don't." The recording ended abruptly. Kyle staggered out of the studio into the bright light of the morning. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the horrors he had endured. But as he walked down the street, he noticed something chilling. Every shadow, every reflection, every glimmer of glass seemed to hold a figure, watching him. The whispers were still with him, faint but persistent, a constant reminder that the story wasn't over. And as he passed a storefront window, his reflection stopped. It didn't move when he did. It smiled. And in that moment, Kyle understood. He hadn't escaped. He never would. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.